Hello and welcome back to The Walking Dead Retrospective, where today we are jumping headfirst into the Commonwealth and the very controversial arc that are the Reapers. A thing to note before we get into the story itself is that because of the odd structure of the season, we'll be jumping between not just the comic and the TV show, but also entirely separate arcs in the show itself. So don't be too surprised if I jump over something or truncate things and so on. It's all just to make this whole thing flow a little bit better and to draw up some of these still existing similarities to the book. And to very quickly illustrate what I mean, everything we'll be talking about today comes from literally 2 comic book issues, whereas the show replicates those beats across 5 whole episodes. The same story beats are sorta there, but they're just very disjointed in the show. But alright, we've got a ton to talk about, so without further ado, let us dive right in. When we left off in the book, Michonne had just seen the Wall of the Lost and was being led right into the heart of the Commonwealth. In the show, on the other hand, the whole questioning is massively extended, and Eugene also has an entirely separate interrogation where he finally cracks, so let's pick up there. After being thoroughly grilled by Mercer, Eugene is once again handcuffed and blindfolded. This whole juxtaposition of him supposedly being arrested all over again, only to be then brought to his friends, all of whom have been cared for, and for Mercer to just casually announce that you are now all citizens of the Commonwealth. I thought it was really cool. I mean, of course, it is obviously heavily dramatized, but I really like that sort of Terminus vibe that is entirely flipped on its head. And what made it even greater is the quote-unquote Stephanie introduction that happens here, while in reality, she is of course a super secret CIA agent. If you recall what I said last time with the Commonwealth seeming somewhat incompetent with just how quickly the survivors got the upper hands, well then this is the direct opposite of that, and is exactly what I would expect from a community of 50,000, 10 plus years into the apocalypse. We'll get to this plenty more, but in my opinion, this entire remix with all Slippin, Jimmy, Lance was the perfect example of how to take the comic material and expand it in just a way that makes sense. It doesn't add a whole bunch of meaningless filler, it doesn't add like 15 other bad guys we have to go through first. No, it just takes Lance as he was in the comic book and gives him this additional layer to just further drive home just how corrupt the Commonwealth really is. Or, you know, exactly as they did with the governor many years ago. They took the comically evil, I will slice your hand off monster and added this whole charming and scheming dimension to just make him more realistic. But in the process of that, they never lost his ruthlessness. Yes, some of the violence is toned down, mostly due to censorship, but the idea of him killing anyone and everyone is very much there. So yeah, this is one of very few times in the later seasons of the show where I think they took a equally, if not more realistic approach to the story. In the book, the survivors were just so overwhelmed by the forces of the Commonwealth that the simplicity of the interview sort of made sense. I mean, there was literally just nothing else they could do, there was no point in scheming. The show, on the other hand, doesn't yet emphasize the overwhelming military might, but adds this constant watchful eye to account for that discrepancy. 10 out of 10 great add-in chef's kiss. What is most certainly not a 10 out of 10 great add-in chef's kiss are the Reapers. First off, them rolling up on the main street is like the dumbest thing I have ever seen. They try to be overwhelming just like the Saviors or even the Commonwealth soldiers, but they come off as absolute clowns, just all neatly marching in a line. This is literally that me and the boys walking meme. The sequence as a whole tries telling you that the survivors are overwhelmed and that this is mega spooky, but thematically, it just doesn't fit at all in my opinion. And it's not just this sequence either. We also have the whole Maggie opening the doors only for a knife to suddenly fly directly next to her head. But then she enters the building and poof, she's out of the NPC's range and it's all quiet. Ha, gotcha, because it's not. There's another one slowly popping up behind her. Then you have her running into Alden and once again, perfectly on cue, they are attacked. It's just beyond dramatized to the point that it feels like Resident Evil, and that's not throwing shade at RE, it's one of my favorite franchises, but it's just not The Walking Dead. And speaking of, the Alden thing is just the epitome of that. These guys are not Plaga-infused Super Soldier Krauser throwing a flashbang and literally disappearing. They're supposed to be just dudes. It is absolutely style over substance, and that just makes this entire conflict feel completely and utterly weightless because none of it really makes any sense. Why should I feel scared if a dude is slowly popping up behind Maggie and she could have been dead like 50 times over? But alright, we've had the good, we've had the bad, now it's time for ugly doesn't really make sense, so mixed. But before we get to said mixed, there's a really cool callback here with Aaron mentioning buttons, a reference that goes all the way back to early Alexandria where he and Daryl went out on one of their missions. Just a neat little wink at those who remember. I will never forget. Take me back, man. Those were the days. Anyway, a major part of early Season 11 are all the troubles within Alexandria post-Whisper War. This is of course a pretty big departure from the books, where aside from a few basic repairs like the main gates and stuff, there really isn't too much destruction. The hilltop is rebuilt from scratch, Alexandria rebuilds very quickly, and we move right into the Commonwealth with their own domestic problems. And with that in mind, a common criticism of the Commonwealth as a whole, even ignoring the fact that it is very rushed, is that it is basically a shortcut for what Rick and the survivors should have been doing. Yes, Alexandria does mark the start of civilization, and we have now withstood many enemies. But the road to something like the Commonwealth would still be very long and complicated. The sheer existence of the Commonwealth sorta truncates all of that. We go from a few hundred from a basic society to an entirely re-established one with 50,000. And the somewhat confusing thing about the show is that instead of working to solve that issue, it almost leans into that criticism. In the comic book, things weren't exactly great, but things weren't bad either. We were more so searching for allies. In the show, on the other hand, it feels like we are searching for help. Alexandria is in a very dire state, and eventually it basically relies on the hope of the Commonwealth to even get by. To me, it seemed like the Commonwealth is not a shortcut as it was in the comic, but rather just an outright replacement for what we were doing. And don't misunderstand me, I kind of actually like the hopelessness we see in Alexandria as we try to rebuild. I think it does add a very interesting dimension to the fallout of the Whisper conflicts. But because the Commonwealth story always runs in tandem, I feel like the impact of basically all of it is instantly diminished because, well, we already have a ready-made community just waiting for us. All of these struggles sort of mean nothing when there is a solution just waiting. This isn't the Prison vs. Woodbury where resources actually matter. This is like, well, there really isn't a comparison because they eclipse the survivors in every single way. So all in all, I do think that the entire struggle we see in Alexandria does sort of work to deliberately contrast how tough life is for the survivors and how trivial the challenges are within the Commonwealth. But at the same time, big picture-wise, it also sort of diminishes that entire struggle. So yeah, not entirely good, not entirely bad. Mixed. And speaking of mixed, wow, I'm on fire with these transitions today. Let us talk about the mighty bad guy who can casually burn people because he has indoctrinated followers. No, I am not talking about Negan. I already talked about the oddities of the Reapers as villains, but I honestly don't even think that's the biggest problem with them. Sure, they're goofy, but I don't think that's an issue. I think the far greater problem is that the producers seemingly never learned any lessons from their past failures with all these filler villains. Guess it's cool that Aaron brought up Buttons, because coincidentally, I think the best comparison can be found in Season 5. That being the Dawn and Beth story. Generally, the criticism for that part of the story is that it goes nowhere since Beth just dies, Dawn is just a boring villain, or plain and simple, it is just filler. But all of that, I think, is colored by the fact that we just fought off the Hunters, and now Eugene has revealed that he is not actually a scientist. For comic fans, there was of course an even bigger reason in Alexandria. But point is, there were far more urgent storylines that we were simply more invested in. With Season 11, it's the same problem, tenfold. These are not the comic fans hoping to see Alexandria. The show itself already introduced us to the Commonwealth, we've already seen what they have, and that is easily the most enthralling part of the story. But instead of focusing on that, they throw in a good half-season worth of filler that completely derails the A-plot to focus on the Reapers. I mean, even the infamous Season 7 wasn't as bad, as those mountains of filler just added lore to the Saviors. The Reapers are literal DLC that someone just put in there with little to no vision as to how they actually fit into the larger narrative, aside from Maggie just needing an explanation as to where she's been. But it's not even Maggie dealing with them. We get a whole solo episode of Daryl, and yeah, there is that personal link in Leah, but Daryl is... Maybe this is a controversial take, I don't know, but I think if taken in isolation, Pope is a relatively interesting baddie. And the two different perspectives on the whole thing from Maggie and Daryl could have also been really interesting. But I want to put emphasis on the taken in isolation. The problem is that most of Season 10 was this exact sort of revenge plot. On top of that, there is just a far more interesting A-plot in the Commonwealth. Daryl has already been through a far worse form of this same sort of imprisonment. He has also had a similar personal conflict with Dwight, and much of Pope's characterization is the same exact tyrant we've already seen with Negan. It just feels like an undeveloped idea that is entirely removed from the rest of the story. So yes, definitely another mixed one. Finally, jumping on over to the Commonwealth, the rest of the introduction is once again drastically different. In the books, we already talked about the whole Lance interview, but right after, they are led straight into the community, and with Michonne demanding to see her daughter, they also get a meeting with Pamela herself. Before that though, we also see Stephanie yell out and go to greet Eugene. Spoilers, yes, this is the actual Stephanie. Though before they can properly talk, Lance already screams at her to get back, then asking whether he should remind her of her unauthorized radio use and whether or not they should revisit some appropriate punishments. And of course, note that all of this was completely uncharted territory. Knowing Kirkman's writing, all of this could have easily been leading us straight into a death trap. So despite this seemingly smooth integration, I wouldn't say the tenseness in the story had let up even the tiniest bit, especially with moments like this. He doesn't quite have the range of Slippin Jimmy in the show, but Lance is definitely swinging from a super by-the-book official to a I will scream your head off very quickly. But anyway, we also get a bit more lore on how they classify differently sized hordes and how they move, again implying their extensive combat experience. Though it's as we reach Pamela that things get really interesting. While the rest of the group are all sat down, Michonne is led for a one-on-one with Pamela. Similar to Yumiko, this is because of her being a lawyer. Pamela goes on this whole little speech about how they're putting together wheels and bolts and screws to make engines, and how those engines drive civilization. She even does the typical authoritarian thing of turning to her guard and asking whether he, a brute, knows that civilization would fall into chaos without the order they create. Basically all of this is just framing Pamela as an absolute glass cannon. She is not a pirate-looking ruthless governor, she's not a mega chad wielding a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, and she's also not a slightly unhinged lady cosplaying walkers. She's a calm, intelligent, neatly dressed woman leading this massive community almost like a small country. But again, that whole engine speech, that dismissive attitude of her guards. Underneath that calm exterior, obviously we already see that her worldview certainly does not align with Rick. She's definitely not posed as a villain, but she does have some antagonistic traits. And Michonne sort of vocalizes just that, just saying that she was trying to humor her in hopes that this would be the fastest way to get these formalities over and done with. And she then just screams out that her daughter, somehow she's here and somehow she's alive. And suddenly, that entire speech, all of those doubts we might have had about Kirkman's intentions with this community are once again entirely flipped upside down. Pamela says that she's a mother herself and that she can't even imagine what Michonne is feeling, even saying that she's surprised how much restraint Michonne has shown already considering the circumstances. And equally surprisingly, she says that she would be her personal escort to the bakery, and Michonne just actually meets Elodie. No fake outs, no Kirkman twists, nothing. We actually met the leader of the next big community, talked to them one-on-one. Even though our views might be very different, they are reasonable. And we then just got one of the most unexpected reunions that the comic could have even had. So, can I call this a classic Kirkman move? Exactly because it's not a classic Kirkman move? Does it work like that? But okay, before we continue with them, let's look back to the show. First off, episode 5 just opening with the Lance video is absolutely genius and just has this surreal vibe to it in the absolute best way possible. It's like, it doesn't fit in a show like The Walking Dead, like, at all. Neither in terms of look, nor vibe, nor style, or even how it's presented. And that is exactly what makes it so great. The show uses just about every sense possible to make us feel just as uncomfortable as the characters in universe. For that brief moment, we are entirely detached from the rules of the show that we thought we knew. It is not us watching the survivors watch the video. No, it is us being fully immersed in this presentation. Something that, again, breaks every convention of The Walking Dead. It's just an excellent way to very visually establish a completely different vibe for this arc. 10 out of 10, chef's kiss. The one and only problem I really have with this is that I feel like the show never really managed to capture the true scale of the Commonwealth. I think the one single time where you really realize the scale of this community was in the finale, because we finally got some massive establishing shots. In the book, one of the first things we see are these streets that are absolutely filled with people. The show, on the other hand, and do keep in mind that this could easily just be a lasting safety measure from the Great Plague, always felt oddly dead and empty. And they also seemingly just refused to give us big sprawling establishing shots. I don't know why, it just felt small. That aside though, the Fight the Dead, Save the Living is an S-tier spin on the ever-iconic Fight the Dead, Fear the Living slogan. Give a raise to the person who came up with that. No, like, seriously, that's not a joke, do it right now. Also, them just being given straight-up job positions is another excellent addition that just added to the creepiness of this whole ordeal. It's just like, wait, what do you mean I'm a teacher? We're here for supplies and help. But with the entire introduction already having been drastically different from the comic, the sort of odd vibe of everything being slightly off continues here too. After watching the video, Eugene just says that they don't even want to stay here, but the dude just calmly says,
"Take it up with the case supervisor."
Huh?
In a very, very different way, I think it perfectly captures that unease that the comic has had up until this point. Not through the overwhelming force that is the Commonwealth military, but the direct opposites. Eugene and the others are just dropped right into the middle of this supposed paradise with nothing. The people here act according to some contracts and papers, and what even is this? As much as I think the direct contact with Pamela in the book was really cool considering how rare people should be this far into the apocalypse, and by the way, don't forget that the TV show is like 7 to 8 years ahead of the comic book, I still thought them just being treated as just another face was a really interesting way to go about it. Though somewhat similar to Michonne, Yumiko has been given an exclusive letter, which she then just shows to the same dude we just talked about. And following that, they're quickly led to the bakery named Elodie's Treats. I'll give you 3 guesses to what it's referencing. And with the reunion itself, the show replicates the book almost shot for shot. Michonne sees Elodie carrying out the cake, and as their eyes meet, she drops it to the floor and they just run to hug each other. I guess if you really want to pick apart the scene, the cake is a neatly assembled, repeatedly processed, and highly presentable food that now falls onto the floor as the personal bonds between Alexandria and the Commonwealth are unveiled, following which the pretty facade that is the cake would fall apart. That neatly presentable facade is now just a mess on the floor, and what matters most are those human bonds. My philosophy aside, the rest of the reunion plays out a little differently. It is of course important to note that we have infinitely more investment into Michonne's character as opposed to Yumiko's. Not just because of the time they've spent in the series, but also because Michonne has been Rick's number one and shared in his grief. So naturally, all of these moments just hit a whole bunch more with Michonne. In the show though, Yumiko and Tommy have a little lunch date where they catch up, talk about the community as a whole, and generally have a pretty happy little reunion. There are still some undertones of corruption here, but still it has an upbeat vibe. The comic, on the other hand, leans a bit more in the emotional damage department. For Michonne, meeting Elodie clearly comes with a whole lot of firsts all over again. Something that I think is portrayed beautifully through that slightly awkward introduction to our apartments. It's like the most normal, just mundane thing. But I think many of you will know that slightly bizarre feeling of showing off your place to a relative that you are sort of really close with, but a ton of time has passed. Now add this being The Walking Dead on top of that. I feel like I'll be repeating this a whole lot throughout the Commonwealth, but I think the best word to describe it is just surreal. On top of that, Elodie is not Michonne's only daughter, so the horrific question always rattling around her mind is, but where is Colette? Though as you'd expect, it's not long until both let their guard slip and once again break down in tears. With these two, their whole vibe is a ton more bittersweet, with Michonne talking about all of her regrets, Elodie mentioning that Colette didn't make it, which just opens up that wound all over again, and generally, there's a whole lot more pain than with Tommy and Yumiko. And before we move on, in the show, there are a whole bunch of tangential stories going on as well. Quite a few times we loop back to Alexandria and all the rebuilding there, with everything from catching horses to, well, explicit rebuilding. Again, this is basically not a concern at all in the books. We also see the retaking of Hilltop, which is now home to a few ex-Whisperers. Like we've talked about before, this is a huge departure from the books. There, rebuilding begun immediately, with Carl and Maggie taking front stage. Basically just copy-paste what I said about Alexandria. Conceptually, it is really cool that both of these communities are just completely destroyed. But again, there is a ready-made community of over 50,000 that, sort of diminishes our entire journey. That said though, the whole Remnants of the Whisperers angle is a slight spin on Jesus finding a small camp of them in the books. Only in the show, Aaron is a lot less forgiving with this whole thing. A massive change for the show is the entirety of Connie's story, who, don't forget, got a good old Walking Dead certified nonsensical fake-out death. And with this episode, I have some really mixed thoughts, because I think the whole House of Horrors is absolutely incredible and easily some of the spookiest stuff we had ever seen in the show. Perhaps that's not entirely surprising as it's Greg Nicotero directing the episode. But purely on a conceptual level, it is another excellent example of how to leverage just about every sense to push that emotional distress of the characters onto us as the viewers. I will keep saying this until it comes true, but can you imagine a Walking Dead story at the very start of the apocalypse, where we see the slow and horrific collapse of society directed by Nicotero? Seeing some people slowly lose their minds, seeing the military just leave people behind, seeing others just desperately try to cling onto the old world with everything they have. It could even be like the World War Z book, and I mean the book, not the movie. I don't know why they're called the same thing. They are completely different. They literally share nothing in common. Read the book, it is excellent zombie material. You have no idea what I'd give for a story like that. Greg just has this way of pushing that horror side of The Walking Dead to the forefront so effectively without it ever feeling forced. And the eyes in the cabinets? Sheesh. That being said, big picture-wise, this episode is also just that. It's a concept, not a story. It genuinely feels like the writers were all sitting around a table and someone threw out an idea about these feral people living in this horror mansion. Everyone agreed that it sounds really cool, but they just moved on, because it is just that. The only thing it really does, I guess, is kind of reintroduce Virgil, but considering how chaotic the season is already, it just feels really out of place. Especially with the rest of the episode being the Reapers, which again loops back to that question of whether or not Season 11 is two entirely separate seasons smushed together as a result of the cancellation. Again, if Season 11 originally was entirely focused on the Reapers and Connie's episode was just a bottle episode eventually leading to a rescue, it still wouldn't be perfect, but it would make a whole lot more sense. Right now though, we have the stories of Alexandria and Hilltop rebuilding, we have the Reapers and Daryl being captured, and we have the mainline story that is the Commonwealth with Lance's CIA and everything that entails. It just removes urgency from what should be the most important story, or stories in this case. It's a really cool concept for an episode, but I just think it should have been developed into an actual value-add bit of story. Otherwise, it just further bloats what is already a season that feels like a hodgepodge of just random ideas and directions. Returning to the book for a bit, the outlook on everything really is far different to that of the show. If there we see Alexandria and Hilltop in ruin, then the comic post-Whisperer War has the sense of a spring after a harsh winter. We might have lost many very important people along the way, but now there are new opportunities and new relationships blossoming just about everywhere. Mikey is chilling with Rick and they talk about a poem he's written. In case you need a TLDR refresher, Mikey lost his parents and Rick has taken him under his wing now that Carl too has grown up. But yeah, Mikey just says that he wants to express his feelings, then saying that maybe Rick should try something similar for Andrea, though Rick just says that he wouldn't even know where to begin. As much as there is some very painful loss, it more so carries a positive vibe of a new beginning. And on a similar note, we see a few of the Hilltop guards catch Dante and Maggie having a little bit of fun time. So again, definitely a much different vibe to the show where the writers are still chaining Maggie to Negan, even now, like years later. As we talked about last time with Negan's solo issue, she has left him behind. His cruel acts of violence will never be forgiven, and he will spend the rest of his days alone just retreading those memories. Maggie, on the other hand, has moved on and finally let someone else into her life. Sure, the whole thing is still quite awkward and complicated. She herself even says that she feels ashamed of herself. But finally, Maggie is allowing herself to open up. There is still a whole bunch more drama to follow, but again, the story is one of renewal. So as far as the fallout of the war goes, I don't think either version is really better per se, they're just extremely different. The show just doesn't have anything that is even remotely comparable to the death of Andrea. So you kinda need to have some level of loss, which in this case I think is done with the absolutely destroyed communities. At the same time, it does feel a little odd to deal with those ramifications in Season 11 instead of just right after the war in Season 10. It's sort of the same exact issue we had with Negan. The reason why the start of Season 7 felt just so incredibly weird is because we effectively opened with a resolution to the previous arc instead of hitting the ground running. An even more direct comparison would be Seasons 3 to 4. The finale of Season 3 is the Governor's attack, but Season 4 opens not with the aftermath of that attack, but with us already having rebuilt and the prison is thriving. With Season 11 and the Whisperers, it just becomes yet another thing hanging in the background that is just compounded by all the other stories we have going on. It's very hard to describe without going over all the story beats all over again, but I think the fastest way of saying it is that the comic is sort of hopeful and the Commonwealth is this thing to strive for, whereas in the show, we are all a bit more miserable and the Commonwealth is rather a glimmer of hope. Returning to the show for a bit, another major remix happens with Eugene and the CIA version of Stephanie. In the comic, we already saw the whole Stephanie being penalized for illegally using the radio. The show puts a spin on that with Eugene's group attempting to do that in the present day. And this is something that I actually thought was incredibly big brain of the writers. In the later seasons, I've said many times how it feels like the survivors are the only player characters surrounded by NPCs, right? Everyone around us is incredibly easy to manipulate, our shortcomings are never penalized, etc, etc. Well, this is the perfect example of how to do that, but infinitely better. On the surface, yes, Eugene is casually snooping around this community and even manages to get to the radio. It shows us the adaptability of the survivors and how they are instantly willing to break rules to ensure their own safety. Only, it's not that simple, because in reality, we know that all of this is being orchestrated by Lance and the fake Stephanie. It makes us think that they have gotten ahead, but in reality, they're directly feeding Lance exactly what he wants to know. Finally, there is an actual force punishing the character's mistakes. Eugene trusted what is effectively a stranger and was instantly blasted. Yes, please, more of this, less of aimbot one-taps against a machine gun, less God mode cave adventures, and please, less stumbling among walkers in the middle of a literal war zone. But okay, my saltiness aside, in the book, accessing a radio isn't really a thing right now, and there isn't a huge time crunch to get back in contact with Alexandria either. And also, the arrest angle and them being thrown in this whole walker cleanup thing is top tier material. In the book, we cut to Sebastian on a date, and as he is enjoying said date, a whole bunch of walkers begin stumbling up. Naturally, Mercer throws a whole bunch of axes to deal with them, something that spooks both Sebastian and the girl. Being the brat that he is, he just begins to scream at Mercer about how he couldn't have killed them sooner, yada yada, but Mercer just apologizes. Quickest comparison is that in the comic, he's kinda like the Hound to your Joffrey. In the show, this whole date is pretty heavily remixed. Like I mentioned at the top of the video, this whole thing is incredibly disjointed because Eugene's arrest happens in episode 5. Then you have the whole House of Horrors with Connie, and only in episode 7 do we begin to follow up with that. But again, the whole thing is interspersed with all the other stories, which I think just takes away from all the urgency of the Commonwealth. And most of all, I think that is true for Mercer. In the book, it is in this same issue that Mercer has already made it clear just how much he hates Sebastian, and the talks of revolts have been going on for a long time. Something that is quickly turned up to 11 as we see Sadiq overhearing their entire conversation. So yes, we are 2 issues in and things are already pretty spicy. But okay, that aside, as Eugene's crew are clearing out the walkers, they notice Sebastian on a date. Some 27 other stories later, we see Eugene and fake Stephanie taking out a whole bunch of them only for blood to get on Sebastian's girlfriend. Okay, but the walker's like slowly stumbling up to her is like really dumb. Eugene punching Sebastian is S tier bans though, and so is Ezekiel showing up with lollipops, and so is the princess flirting with Mercer. But yes, with yet another crime under his belt, Eugene is thrown into a cell and visited by none other than Slippin Jimmy. In the book, we would kinda sorta see similar shenanigans with the princess very soon. But as of now, the show takes a pretty big departure with Lance just constantly fishing for information regarding Alexandria. Something that hasn't really been addressed basically at all in the book. Aside from the whole goofy walker situation, I think this whole angle of tying together Eugene and Sebastian instead of just Mercer and Sebastian was a really interesting move. I just wish the whole thing was told in a more cohesive manner rather than sprinkled in among like 3 different completely unrelated things, half of which are not even relevant by the time the Commonwealth story actually picks up steam. And with that, this is where I'll pick up next time. As you might be able to tell, I am pretty liberally jumping over much of the TV side stories as they really are just going through the motions until we finally get into the Commonwealth proper. Again, I think much of that pretty clearly just loops back to that major pivot during production. Even with the extension to season 11, I think many of the ideas were left half-baked, because they kinda were. Suddenly, they had to wrap up the show, but they couldn't just scrap all the work that had likely been done for the Reaperzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz story. And as a result, we have this wild mixture of just completely inconsistent ideas. The early Commonwealth part of the story is all really good, but we then have these one-offs like Daryl being captured or Connie's House of Horrors that maybe you don't even think are bad, but they do just seem aimless. But anyway, next time in the show 2, we'll be finally meeting Pamela for the first time, while in the comic, we'd be welcoming her to our own Alexandria. So, I hope to see you back next time for the start of the end of the Walking Dead retrospective. And that's the video. Definitely a very chaotic one, but still a fun little challenge to piece together. Feels kinda surreal to say this, but now that we're just a couple weeks away from The Ones Who Live, the retrospective might take a slight detour depending on how I'm feeling about Rick's return. At this point, I do feel like it's all but confirmed that there are more seasons on the way, so I'll be very curious to see what they're cooking up. Oh yeah, and I am thinking of streaming my reactions to the episodes, so keep an eye on the second channel for that. I might do that, I might not, we'll see what happens. But anyway, with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!